Here we go then. The Olympiahalle, Munich, Germany. It's Thursday, the 20th of October 1977, and Rainbow are getting stuck into their second European tour. The band for this gig were Ritchie Blackmore on guitar, Cozy Powell on drums, and Ronnie James Dio on vocals, with new boys Bob Daisley on bass and David Stone on keyboards, who were drafted in just a few weeks before the tour began. As always at this time, Rainbow start the set with Kill the King. Although a studio version wouldn't appear on vinyl until the long-lived rock and roll album in 1978, the track had been written back in early 1976 during rehearsals for the first European tour. Working on a set list, they decided that they were short of a suitably fast and furious set opener, something which fulfilled the role that Byrne had done for Deep Purple from 1973 onwards. Kill the King worked so well that they decided to keep it for the 77 shows too. The stage version features far more keyboard work, however, than the studio take, while the lyrics, according to Ronnie James Dio, actually relate to a chess match. This show was very late starting. In fact, it almost got pulled altogether. 2 nights before, trouble had begun at Rainbow's show in Austria, when Ritchie saw heavy-handed security staff shoving and pushing around some of the fans down at the front of the stage. He took a bottle of beer and emptied it over the main offender. Tempers rose, however, and fisticuffs inevitably followed, and as a result, Ritchie was arrested and jailed overnight for thumping one of the guards. The Munich gig was scheduled for the 19th, but with Ritchie in jail, they decided to put it back a day and hoped that the lawyers could sort things out. He was finally released on the 20th and driven straight by car to Munich, with anxious promoters keeping their fingers crossed that he'd make it in time. In normal circumstances, they would probably have cancelled the gig, but as German TV was set up to film the event for the long-running Rockpalast programme, it was important to try and save the show. For a first-hand account of what actually went on, I suggest you have a look at Bob Daisley's interview. It's rather enlightening. Back to the gig, and the support band Kingfish did an extra long set, and Blackmore finally arrived at the hall. Rainbow hit the stage around midnight. The audience had been kept informed of the delays and were offered a refund if they wanted to leave early. By the time the band came on, quite a few had actually been forced to accept, and that's why you might notice a smaller than usual audience. The tour, however, was almost a complete sellout. Having said that, what the audience lack in numbers, they certainly made up for in enthusiasm. As for the Austrian judicial system, well, Blackmore's case was eventually heard early in 1978, and he was fined the equivalent of £5,000 for breaking the guard's jaw. Looking at the equipment setup here, it's a typically 70s arrangement. Let's look particularly at the expansive keyboard rig that David Stone uses. We have the classic Hammond chop favoured by many players of the time. It must be said, mostly to help the roadies. David is also using a Mini Moog D-Series keyboard, now a very collectible piece of kit, although you could probably buy the software that recreates that sound for rather less money these days. By the specialist tour lighting company C Factor in New York in the summer of 1975. They built it in 4 15-foot sections to ease erection on stage and of course dismantling it afterwards. The frame was covered in gauze and the bulbs were controlled by a rather primitive computer which would switch the bulbs on and off in sequence to create the amazing effects. Nothing like it had been seen before, and it could prove quite a mesmerising experience from the auditorium. The inspiration for the unit had come to Blackmore at the California Jam Festival, which Deep Purple had headlined back in 1974. The stage there had been straddled by a large painted wooden rainbow, which ran behind the back line. After he formed his new group, Blackmore recalled the event and asked if something along the same lines could be made for touring. The prop proved very expensive to take on the road, however. For the 1977 European tour alone, the bills for transporting and running it came to over £50,000. During 1978, Rainbow began to gig more in America and take some support slots. As it would clearly have been a very hard act to follow, the electronic Rainbow was quietly retired and never returned. Fans have since speculated on where it ended up. There were, of course, rumours that it was sold to a dolphin marine park, while Ritchie told one journalist they'd actually thrown it overboard from a transport ship on the way back from Japan in 1978, which was the last tour that it appeared at. Anyone, however, hopefully keeping an eye on eBay might have a long time to wait before it appears. This particular tour saw them playing over 40 dates over the continent, and had been due to begin in Helsinki on September the 23rd, though the opening show was pulled when the gear failed to arrive on time. To mark the tour, Polydor issued an EP with a live edit of Kill the King as the A-side, taken from the band's new live album On Stage. The 1977 setlist followed that of the 1976 tour closely. The second song in was Mistreated, a number first recorded by Deep Purple back in 1973 for the Burn album and a mainstay of their live set during 1974 and 1975. The basic riff seems to have been laid down by Blackmore some years before. Indeed, it's possible that it was actually done while Ian Gillan was still with the band. But Blackmore wanted a bluesier vocal sound, which of course he found when David Coverdale joined the group in 1973. David put the lyrics together during the rehearsal sessions for Burn. When Rainbow were formed, Blackmore retained just this one number from his days with Purple, and Rainbow's live versions were always magical, if less brutal than Purple's. Fans, however, still continue to argue over which was the better version. David Coverdale later covered the song live with Whitesnake, and Ronnie James Dio has also reprised the Rainbow version in recent solo tours as well. It's a lengthy number too, and highlights Blackmore's gentle electric playing, in contrast to the heavy closing section. As mentioned earlier, Rainbow was sporting 2 new players for this tour. Although the group were only a couple of years old, they'd already changed lineup 3 times. Something Blackmore was to make a bit of a habit of over the next few years. Before they began touring, Ritchie and Ronnie had jettisoned the recording band Elf and brought in Cozy Powell, a veteran of many bands, who'd actually worked with Britain's other top guitarist, Jeff Beck. They formed the backbone of this early group, with Tony Carey and Jimmy Bain brought in on keyboards and bass respectively. After the First World Tour, Bain and Carey were fired, and much of 1977 was spent looking for replacements. Jimmy Bain was offered his job back but declined. Mark Clark from Colosseum came in for a while, after which Blackmore took to playing the bass parts on the new album himself. They were really up against it as the year progressed and had to put back the start of the tour until they could draft in new players. Ritchie heard David Stone on a record by a group called Symphonic Slam and tracked him down. Auditions also yielded Australian Bob Daisley on bass, looking for work after the band Widowmaker had split up. Rainbow were up and running once again. Ritchie's solo portion of the song isn't that long on this version. Often he would extend this section until the track ended up well over the 12 or 13 minute mark. The days of Rainbow's 3-minute pop songs were still some years off. It's this sort of playing which really marked Blackmore out from most other rock musicians. His mastery of all aspects of the electric guitar were never in more evidence than on some of these early Rainbow performances, and often the crowd would be hushed to silence as he experimented with some of these softer runs. Ritchie's delay and echo effects here are achieved by the reel-to-reel machine you can see behind him from time to time. It also pre-boosts the signal to the amp and was operated by a simple foot pedal. Hard to believe, but the arrangement caused some less informed fans and at least one professional journalist to speculate that Ritchie was actually miming to pre-recorded backing tapes, something that in hindsight is clearly ludicrous. Here's a nice close shot of the scalloped fingerboards on Ritchie's guitars. These allow for better note bending and vibrato. It was something that he first came across on an old acoustic guitar. He developed this technique during Deep Purple's days, and it became one of his trademarks. In later years, a Blackmore signature model was produced, which enabled others to try and emulate the effect. With Rainbow, Blackmore stuck religiously with his Stratocaster guitars. He had moved over from Gibson's back at the start of Deep Purple's days, as the cleaner sound suited him, and he liked the challenge of a guitar which was a little harder to play and which could be turned up louder as well. The on-stage Rainbow affected the guitar, however, quite a lot, so he had his done out with modified pickups, added low-impedance mic cables, as well as bigger Gibson frets. Blackmore is also using his Taurus bass pedals here to get those thunderous bassy crashes. These pedals were very popular during the period, and other musicians such as Rush's Geddy Lee also utilised this particular effect. Blackmore had learned to play electric bass some years before, and it's perhaps his abilities in this area which led him to become frustrated with Rainbow's bassists over the years. This didn't resolve itself until he was able to persuade Deep Purple bassist Roger Glover to forsake his work behind the control desk and return to the stage in 1979. Note the various signals and cues given to the rest of the band by Blackmore. He always liked to run a tight ship on stage in Rainbow, and these cues enabled him to have the freedom to stretch out if he wished, without throwing the other musicians. As we noted earlier, the band were effectively promoting the live album on stage during the 1977 tour. They had recorded some of the German and Japanese shows using the Rolling Stones mobile on the 1976 tour, initially just for the Japanese market. The end result, however, was so good that it was soon decided to release it worldwide in July 1977. Although the band felt it was perhaps a little early to be issuing a live record, something was needed to plug the long delay between studio albums, and it also helped counter the growing problem of bootlegs. On Stage was a reasonable album, despite the fact that some of the tracks were edited, and astonishingly, the climactic highlight of the tour, Stargazer, was left off. Years later, the tapes from that tour were revamped to make the more representative Live in Germany CD, and recently plans for 3 of the shows to come out in a remix form were finalised. If nothing else, following the 2 studio albums, On Stage helped cement the band's reputation in Europe and Japan, and with this market well and truly conquered, they could turn their attentions to the thornier question of America, where they still had a lot of work to do. Bob Daisley, as we said, had been in a band called Widowmaker. Despite, or perhaps because of the supergroup label, Widowmaker had failed to impress the public. Despite players of such pedigree as Ariel Bender, Steve Ellis, Zoot Money and Hawkwind's Hugh Lloyd Langton, their debut album for Jet Records in 1976 didn't sell well, and the follow-up flopped completely. But Bob Daisley had been around for some years before this. He'd been a member of cult Australian band Carvis Jute before journeying to the UK to further his career. Bob talks in more depth about the bands he'd played in before Rainbow on the interview section of this DVD. Here we can see Bob Daisley playing a rather well-used Fender Precision bass guitar. This instrument is considered to be the warhorse of rock basses and used by many of the greats over the years, including, in the early days of Deep Purple, Roger Glover. Once in the UK, Bob worked with Chicken Shack, playing on their 1973 album Unlucky Boy. He even played on some of the later singles from Mungo Jerry. His time, however, with Rainbow was short-lived. He may have overdubbed some bass parts onto the album Long Live Rock and Roll, but when Blackmore recruited Roger Glover to help produce the next album, Down to Earth, Bob Daisley's days were clearly numbered. Nevertheless, the Rainbow gig had upped his profile considerably, and he later went on to work for Uriah Heep, Ozzy Osbourne and Gary Moore. More recently, he has been part of a new recording band, Living Loud, alongside current Deep Purple guitarist Steve Morse. Usually during this track, Ronnie James Dio was able to ad-lib a little, although for some reason on this occasion he cuts it short. Perhaps the band were a little tired having to go on so late, or maybe even he had to consider the time slot for the television presentation. For most fans, Ronnie's period with the group was a highlight. It's not even certain that the group would have existed without him. His involvement with music stretched back into the late 50s, but it was with the Electric Elves that his career began to take shape in 1967. They first became the Elves and then just Elf in 1970, playing bars and clubs in America. Ian Pace and Roger Glover happened upon them during a night off from touring with Deep Purple. Suitably impressed, they set out to produce the band's second album, Carolina County Ball, and started getting them support slots with Deep Purple. This brought them to the attention of Ritchie Blackmore, who, impressed by Dio's singing, asked him to sing on a solo project in 1974, which ultimately evolved into Rainbow. Although it's often alleged that Greensleeves was written by Henry VIII for Anne Boleyn, in actual fact the style of the piece belongs to a time some decades after King Henry VIII's death. As we were saying earlier, Dio was crucial to Rainbow's evolution. Blackmore wanted to record a version of Black Sheep of the Family, a song originally by British band Quatermass, but Deep Purple hadn't felt like doing cover versions again. They'd more or less given up on that after the demise of Mark I in 1969. So Ritchie asked Ronnie to do the vocals for him on a solo single version. This turned out so well that Blackmore began to consider doing a whole album with Ronnie. This is Ritchie performing the sort of neoclassical stuff no one was even thinking of at the time, blending his love of classical music, medieval phrasing and rock. Although the effect had been even more spellbinding on the 1976 tour and the audiences had become a little noisier in the 12 months since then, nevertheless it still had a stunning effect on the crowds. Blackmore was even taking cello lessons from ELO's Hugh McDowell for a time to further broaden his horizons and to help with his writing. The run in the intro, incidentally, is from Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 3, Movement 2 to be precise. Greensleeves was the first track Ronnie and Ritchie ever wrote together as the B-side to Blackmore's proposed solo single. It was only after Blackmore had booked some studio time that he realised if they were going to issue a single, they'd need a B-side as well, so he asked Dio to come up with something fairly sharpish. In the end, they dropped the single idea and went for a full-blown album instead. He booked time in Germany in early 1975 and they laid down a complete album in just a few weeks. Titled simply Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, it was cut at the Musicland studios in Munich during February and March, a studio Purple had used also a number of times. The end result gave Blackmore the confidence to resign from Purple and go off on his own. The track remains a typical example of Ronnie's swords and sorcery style of lyricism. In his days with Elf, the songs had usually covered more familiar rock and roll territory, but Blackmore wanted to carry on the fantasy style of lyric he'd been pushing David Coverdale to write for some years, songs like Stormbringer and Holy Man being prime examples. Ronnie perfected the approach in Rainbow right from the off. Perhaps his best example was the lengthy Stargazer on the band's second album, which segued into Light in the Black and told a story of Tolkien-esque proportions across an entire side of Rainbow Rising. This style also served him well in later years, both during his time with Black Sabbath and particularly once he'd formed his own band Dio in late 1982. Greensleeves was certainly an ideal stage number, full of changes from light to dark and much heavier than it had been on the record. Indeed, most of the first album sounded underproduced when it came out, and clearly the performance of the band on it hadn't been up to Blackmore's own high standard, which is why he and Ronnie decided to start recruiting again once they'd made the decision to take Rainbow on the road. One aspect of Ritchie's playing that gets little attention is his slide solos. He's not the greatest exponent of the technique, but note the unconventional way of holding the slide. He quite often grabbed a bottle of beer if he couldn't find the proper slide. Getting back to Rainbow's history, their first touring band included Jimmy Bain on bass, who Blackmore had seen working in a group called Harlot at the Marquee. Bain was recruited in time for them to start auditioning drummers, and they'd actually worn out about 12 drummers before Cozy Powell walked into the rehearsal rooms. It was quite a surprise when Bain was fired from the band after the first tour, but he took it in his stride and it certainly helped him establish himself as a player. Tony Carey was the other player replaced for this 77 tour. He'd been fired along with Bain, but then rehired for the third album Sessions. Rumour has it that the sessions became so fraught that he just flitted one morning, took a taxi to the airport at Paris and then disappeared. Clearly Rainbow were developing a pattern here, one which was to continue over the next 6 years or so. Highlight of the live shows around this time, particularly once Stargazer had been dropped. The series of solos and the sense of dynamics lent themselves perfectly to Ritchie's improvisational talents. The intro also includes a nod towards Bach and includes a snatch of Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring. It's hard to think of another rock guitarist around who would dare to play this sort of gentle opening on stage. The number had been one of the highlights of the first Rainbow album, but grew in stature and length on stage. Indeed, the track survived in various shortened forms right up until the end of the band in 1983. Rainbow had made their live debut in America back in November 1975 with a string of shows which were hardly reported back home. It had been a steep learning curve, but was invaluable in addressing the technical problems caused by the electric rainbow that spanned the stage, which generated a huge amount of interference with the amplifiers and the guitars. In February 1976, after the American tour, Rainbow began work on their second album, keen to get something more representative of the new lineup down on vinyl. They'd already done a lot of writing during rehearsals for the first tour, so the album sessions went reasonably smoothly. In fact, the whole album was more or less finished inside 10 days. Once again, the recording took place at Musicland Studios in Munich. It's probably true to say that Rainbow Rising is regarded today as Rainbow's strongest album overall. It set the benchmark for heavy, intense and dynamic hard rock. Side 2 had just 2 long numbers on it, lasting almost 20 minutes. It was an epic achievement, particularly as Cozy Powell did most of his drum parts in one take. Certainly the band achieved a higher public profile in later years with hit singles, which the early albums were never going to bring them, but the move from this early intense music towards a more AOR style wasn't to everyone's taste. A full-blown world tour to promote Rainbow Rising began in America in June 1976, with the group performing tracks from both albums. They even tried to run Stargazer and Light in the Black together on stage, but it left Cozy Powell utterly exhausted, so they soon dropped the second song. It was a difficult tour in other ways, as the band's album hadn't been a huge seller, and the cost of touring as a headliner was heavy. To get around this in one or two states, Rainbow opened up for better-known acts such as Jethro Tull. Elsewhere they pushed on, with Gentle Giant and Angel opening for them. You'll notice Bob Daisley performing backing vocals during this number. Like Bain before him, Daisley was also a writer, but again like Bain, his talents in that area were never called upon in Rainbow, a cause of some frustration for both of them. Catch the Rainbow is a perfect example of how subtle the band could be, something critics sadly never remember them for. These days, if the band's name crops up, inevitably tracks like All Night Long and Since You've Been Gone are the titles associated with them, and much of their early work is totally ignored. Rainbow made their European debut in Britain in late August 1976, and here it was treated like the second coming. For many Deep Purple fans, Blackmore had been the essence of that group, a feeling reinforced by the sometimes lacklustre live shows the band did with his replacement, Tommy Bolin, in early 1976. Although Blackmore hadn't played in Europe since mid-1975, the Rainbow albums had both charted well here, and demand for tickets was huge. They toured across Europe for nearly 2 months before flying on to Australia in November and finally Japan in December 1976. There's another superb improvisation here from Ronnie James Dio, and not even Led Zeppelin were as good at this time, although the latter did have the influential critic's ear, far more of course. Blackmore did try to describe his concept for Rainbow in one interview as a blend of the best of Zeppelin and Purple, and he did pull it off for a while during 1976 and 1977. You've got to remember that punk was just months away, something that's often easy to forget. Rainbow were one of the bands which managed to ride through the period when their style of music was deeply unfashionable amongst most music critics in Britain, though punk had much less of an influence in the rest of Europe or America. Ironically, Blackmore didn't react against punk in the way that many of his contemporaries did. The thing it has is raw energy. Most of it is very badly played, obviously, but I prefer to hear that than the Eagles, he told a reporter from Sounds at the time. At least they're trying to create something with energy, and music is built around energy. Indeed, and some of the heavy riffs in Kill the King and Greensleeves are not that dissimilar to one or two punk anthems if you think about it. As we noted before, 1977 was largely given over to the recording of their third album, and the sessions became the stuff of legend, stretching over 2 months with bass player Mark Clark coming in and going, and Tony Carey going, and then returning, and then going for good. It was the longest time the band had ever spent in the studio, and being out in the wilds of the French countryside added to the claustrophobia. Mind you, they did manage to find time to let Cozy race 1 or 2 of his supercars around and get diverted by football matches. Ritchie also delighted in stories of Elton John recording in the same French studio and being too scared to sleep in some of the haunted rooms of the old chateau. Blackmore takes the song down and down towards the end, seeing how quiet he could get it, and then just when you thought things had finished, in comes the band again, and a great understated yet majestic finish. Perfect dynamics. This is the sort of moment that really made Rainbow special. For those of us lucky enough to witness them firsthand, this DVD really brings it all back to life. The stunned crowd's reaction at the end comes over well, and even 30 years after the event, it's hard not to share in their enthusiasm. From the previous tour's set list. Purists were dismayed at the time. At many of the British shows, Long Live Rock and Roll paper banners were left on seats for the crowd to wave aloft during the chorus. What was going on? Well, the number was unashamedly commercial for certain, but was fully in keeping with Blackmore's aim of trying for a party atmosphere on some of the material, and the desire to try for a few songs which might get airplay on American radio, something they really needed. Kill the King was the only other album cut to make the live show, although it wasn't exactly new, having opened the last tour as well. A short, straightforward run-through of LA Connection, which was another very commercial composition, preceded Long Live Rock and Roll on some early American dates in May 1978, but never became the hit it ought to have been. Some long-standing fans viewed Long Live Rock and Roll as the beginning of the end. Perhaps it was too commercial for people who had taken Rainbow Rising to their hearts, but Rainbow needed to open up the US markets in order to keep the show on the road, and you can't deny, it is very catchy. Although it wasn't released as a single for some 6 months after this tour, when it was, the song gave the band their first taste of single success and raised the profile of the accompanying album. Interestingly, they also made a promo video of the track. Though it wasn't seen much in Europe, it has been rescued from the vaults and is now one of the bonus tracks on this DVD. Incidentally, while we're discussing setlists, we should point out that despite many internet rumours to the contrary, Gates of Babylon, perhaps one of the standout tracks from Long Live Rock and Roll, was never performed live by Rainbow, which is a shame. It got squeezed between the period when Dio left the band and the new lineup, by which time they were keen to promote newer material. However, we have managed to dig out a rarely seen promo for the song, although just where they thought this might get heard isn't clear. Ronnie James Dio, however, did dust the number off and perform a version on his more recent solo tours. Remember those paper banners? It's audience participation time. It's harmless enough looking at it now, but at the time, veterans of Rainbow's awe-inspiring 1976 shows found this akin to Bob Dylan going electric. You can also hear Bob Daisley's backing vocals on this track. Perhaps it's just as well he's such a great bassist. Still, if nothing else, Long Live Rock and Roll allowed everyone to loosen up a bit after the opening 45 minutes of the show. And audiences needed a breather, for Blackmore certainly wasn't finished with their eardrums just yet. Even Cozy Powell questioned the volume at one stage and made sure he got his hearing tested before each tour. Truth is, the loud passages were well spread, and for anyone who had survived Purple's last UK tour, this was a picnic by comparison. Of the Rainbow Roadies, companion and partner in crime to many of Ritchie's practical jokes and seances. He gets a credit on many of the early Rainbow album sleeves. Ritchie had a habit of dropping in short snippets of other songs, and a few bars of an old Deep Purple classic always went down well, Lazy being the usual choice as here, although later tours saw riffs from Child in Time, Woman from Tokyo and others reprised to huge cheers from knowledgeable sections of the crowd, although Blackmore would usually stop short of launching into the song proper. I have to say, it's unlikely you're going to hear Lazy this fast ever again. Nice shot of the sunburst Fender here, particularly with the rosewood neck rather than the maple neck that he'd favoured during his Purple days. This is a 70s model with the wide headstock, allegedly put into production because Fender felt it would show up better on television broadcasts. Man on the Silver Mountain was always a live Rainbow staple, from the first tour in 1975 until around 1982. According to Ritchie, it was also Led Zeppelin's drummer John Bonham's favourite song, something which must have delighted him. It first appeared on Rainbow's album debut, where it was one of the strongest cuts, and it clearly worked well on stage. There's a storming version on the Live in Germany CD, while the take from on stage is not far behind. The guitar blitz and Ritchie's blues piece was first performed in Deep Purple days, back on the Burn tour. Prior to this, Ritchie had rarely done the blues, which was a shame because he could put so much feeling into it. He used it during You Fool No One, and you can see an early version on the recent California Jam DVD. It makes an interesting comparison. David Stone follows the guitar section, and for any musicologists out here, his North American keyboard style is clear to hear. Following the instrumental section, Ronnie James Dio comes in with a short clip of Starstruck, another potential winner that was never performed in its entirety on stage, which again is a shame. Dio was never shy of trying to attempt something new on stage, and Ritchie would often go along with it, although occasionally would deliberately leave Dio hanging just to see how he would get out of it. Another improvisational piece was Night People. Originally it was a track which was listed on early recording details for the Long Live Rock and Roll album. This, plus the snippets heard at various concerts, led to much speculation that it was a fully finished but unreleased number from the sessions. However, according to Cozy Powell, when he was asked about it some years later, it was never finished, even to demo standard, remaining just a jam the band played around with during the writing sessions. Maybe had they lasted long enough together to record a fourth album with the same lineup, it might have been developed further. We of course will never know. Original recorded by the Yardbirds. The band first recorded it on their debut album, but left it as an instrumental. It remains a frustrating track as the mix seems almost to deliberately play down Blackmore's ferocious guitar work. The song was brought into the live set and used during the Dio years as a vehicle for guitar, keyboard and drum solos. I guess it served a similar purpose to that which Space Truckin' did in Deep Purple, building the set to a climax and letting the musicians have a little fun along the way. Still I'm Sad includes an incredible amount of highs, particularly the astute use of dynamics from the band into Ritchie Blackmore's solo, with snatches of Beethoven's Ninth and Ode to Joy, a piece which would further be worked up in the 80s into both a studio rendition and a live favourite, which Blackmore carried on with throughout his stint in the reformed Deep Purple, resplendent at that time with an animated laser light show version of Beethoven on stage, if memory serves me correctly. David Stone also has a chance to shine throughout Still I'm Sad. In hindsight, Stone doesn't appear nearly as upfront as his predecessor Tony Carey, or his eventual replacement Don Airey, come to that. In fact, he made very little contribution to the Rainbow story aside from the live tour. And despite a compositional input to Gates of Babylon, though despite appearing on the sleeve cover he was never credited, he remains one of the lesser-known sidemen from the band. His career after Rainbow is shrouded in mystery. Indeed, his career before Rainbow isn't well documented either. He was in a Canadian band called Symphonic Slam, a sort of prog rock outfit, a trio who recorded material along the lines of Atomic Rooster and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Although Rainbow are usually regarded as a British band, in reality they were quite a cosmopolitan bunch. On stage we have 2 Englishmen, an American, a Canadian and an Australian, while the lineup for the first album was all American apart from Blackmore. From the powerhouse behind the band to the focal point, Colin Cozy Powell's time has come. Along with Dio and Blackmore, this was the influential Rainbow triumvirate. As far as the presentational and technical side of the band was concerned, and probably as far as many fans were concerned too, come to that, check out the double bass drum technique here. Cozy used Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture as the basis for his drum solo, something he initially worked on back in his Jeff Beck group days. The drum solo was actually cut from the on-stage live album, although can be found in full on the Live in Germany double album. However, the visual aspect presented here lends it considerably more impact. Cozy was well aware that not everyone relished drum solos, so rather than just rely on a flash exhibition of the drummer's art, he decided to turn it into a visual tour de force. Cozy had already seen a lot of success before joining Rainbow. He'd been signed by UK producer Mickey Most, famous for no end of chart-topping pop acts, Suzi Quatro and Hot Chocolate just being 2 of them. Most had put out some drum-bass singles and secured a top 10 hit, Dance with the Devil, which had been based on a Jimi Hendrix riff. This inspired a whole generation of kids to start hitting things. Some even went on to become drummers. Needless to say, Cozy quickly tired of the scene when his band ended up playing for crowds of screaming teenage girls. Away from the chart scene, he was working with the group Bedlam, playing really heavy rock. Cozy was ultimately one of the longest-serving Rainbow members, staying with the band almost exactly 5 years. His interest waned, however, as the group became more of an AOR act, and he left following the first Monsters of Rock festival that Rainbow headlined in 1980. He went on to drum for Michael Schenker, Emerson, Lake and Powell, Whitesnake and Black Sabbath before his tragic death in a car accident in 1998. The record, though perhaps with hindsight it might have been an early attempt at something a little more commercial. Live, it served simply as a vehicle for Ritchie's guitar demolitions. Encores were often a sore point with Rainbow fans, for unlike many rock bands, Rainbow didn't just churn out an encore for the sake of it. If Blackmore was unhappy with the band's performance, his own performance, or felt the crowd hadn't been especially enthusiastic enough, he would skip the encore altogether. And if it was the one show you'd attended, then you might be a bit disappointed. Among hardened Rainbow gig-goers, though, guessing whether they'd be back did become part of the evening's entertainment. Clearly, Blackmore felt the Munich crowd deserved a longer show, given all that they'd had to put up with from the delayed start to the rescheduling of the date. The ritual saw the band charge through a couple of verses, Cozy and Daisley powering them along with Ritchie blazing away and Dio really having to push himself to be heard above it all. There was also a huge sense of anticipation from the crowd. They'd got the encore, would Blackmore sacrifice a guitar or not? It'll probably be quite strange for many fans who have listened to live audio versions of this number over the years to actually witness it for the first time. At last count, there were some dozen bootleg audio versions of this show in existence alone, not to mention numerous video copies taken from repeats on German television. The show was actually never broadcast in Britain, the BBC almost never taking up options on showing the hundreds of Rock Palace concerts that were broadcast over the years. Although this is the only full concert in existence of the Dio-fronted band, later lineups would be far better served. Rainbow's Donington 1980 concert was filmed, and a half hour was shown on European television. There was even an edited video release from the San Antonio show in 1982, while the final Rainbow gig in 1984, just before Blackmore rejoined Purple, was released on video and Laserdisc, but only in Japan itself. When Rainbow reformed a decade later, they were again filmed by Rock Palace in October 1995. Hopefully, some of these will appear on DVD in the not-too-distant future. Blackmore had developed this love-hate relationship with his guitar over many years. Back in the 60s, he'd been encouraged by Screaming Lord Sutch to develop his showmanship, or be out of a job. Pete Townsend might have made Guitar Destruction part of The Who's early shows sooner, but Jeff Beck wasn't averse to similar antics. Check the Yardbirds sequence in the film Blow Up, and of course Hendrix took it even further. In Purple, Blackmore held back for a couple of years, but as the second lineup got heavier and more intense, so the occasional guitar would get damaged. There are stories from the early 70s of his anxious roadies trying to recover pieces from the crowd so they could be salvaged or repaired, especially if they'd been machines which had been extensively modified. One of the most famous of all Blackmore's guitar demolitions took place when Purple headlined the California Jam Show in 1974. And it was that gig which perhaps gave him the idea of making it an element of the Rainbow stage show on a more regular basis. One question which still keeps chat rooms busy is, will Rainbow ever reform? With Blackmore, one never knows. The band did of course return with a new lineup and the album Stranger in Us All in 1995 before Blackmore knocked the band on the head for good. There was later serious talk of the original trio getting back together for some special shows in Japan, but nothing was settled and Cozy Powell's death brought negotiations to an end. Ronnie James Dio continues to drop in the odd Rainbow classic to his set, but has said he doesn't expect it to happen. Today, of course, Blackmore has forsaken hard rock for a partnership with singer Candice Night in the group Blackmore's Night. They may play to smaller audiences, and they do occasionally slip in a cover of 16th Century Greensleeves, but Blackmore has long passed the point where he needed to worry about making his living doing what people expect, preferring instead to pursue a musical direction he wants. For the Destruction, the guitar leads were actually nailed in, for obvious reasons. One wonders if these days the venue's safety officer might have something to say about such antics, although Blackmore was usually pretty careful about how they were disposed of. Needless to say, the pieces of the guitar were the subject of intense scrums in the crowd wherever they ended up. Some guitar demolitions saw Blackmore scale the PA, while one, not a million miles away from where we're recording this commentary, saw Blackmore emerge in one of the boxes at the Liverpool's Empire, and batter his guitar around the ornate plaster decoration before dangling the remains into the crowd below, a feat which saw him banned from the venue amid threats of large bills for the repair to the fabric of the building. Blackmore sometimes used Fender copies, and later the Fender guitars used were relatively inexpensive seconds that were modified so they could be glued together again and reused another night, providing they hadn't been carried off as a souvenir by a member of the audience. Here we leave the reduced but clearly more than satisfied crowd filtering out to the strains of Judy Garland, their 20 Deutschmarks, around £3 at the time, well spent. The tour would